So we have reached now the discussion of, I told you about how to create the strings that have apostrophe in it. And what I wanted to tell you today about was structures. So I told you last time that you can have, suppose you want to create a list of all the people in this room, and you want to store their age, their level at the school, their college, and everything, right? So you can have, the most naive way of it would be to create multiple arrays, like age. You have then all the elements here. So you would say, I start with Barrett here. He's 19, I suppose. So then, and so on, you go like that. And then for the next one, let's say, for example, you want to store the school, the college, or the, what is it, the department in which they are. So you say department equals, so you probably are, or all of you are in aerospace. So you would define strings of aero here. Right? And so on. That's one way of doing it. But you will naturally see that your life will be much easier if you could combine all of these variables into just one single object, and then you could pass it to anyone who you want to pass it, like in your program. You want to pass it to a function, for example, or to another collaborator that uses this information for some other purpose. So instead of passing all of these separately from each other, you just have one single object, give him this bag, and say, in this bag, I have all of these variables together. So the way to do this in programming, almost all languages, is through structures. And when you combine structures with functions that act on the structures, what do you get? Classes. Yes, exactly. So classes are simply a set of data in the form of structures that I have shown you here. So it's a collection of variables all together. And a set of functions, or more often we call it what? Methods. Yes. A set of methods that act on those data sets. So those methods have been defined specifically for these data sets. They can only work with these sorts of data sets. They cannot work with anything else. They might be able to work, but they are not defined within the class that you have defined for this set of actions and this data set. So right now, I'm going to tell you about the structures, and then probably in a 2 week or so, we'll get to classes and see how to create, how to merge the methods with this information and get a single object that contains everything in your program, which includes all the functions that you have written as well as the data set that is used by those functions. So there are multiple ways to create structures. Let's start with the simplest one. This is a difficult example, so I'm not going to start with this one because it creates some complexities. Again, because MATLAB is a little bit weird language. So if I wanted to create a structure, I could simply say my struct is, or just let's just pick a simple name, S equals struct. Or I think you might not even need the parentheses, but I most often put it because when you say struct, you mean it's a function, it's not a variable, right? So in order to emphasize that what you're talking about is a function, not a variable, you would use parentheses like this, like what I've used here, right? If I press enter, it gives me a struct. If you click on struct, it's going to probably give you some information about what a structure is. So now if I say class S, what do you get? It says it's a structure object, right? So this structure is a scalar object. It doesn't have dimension. So it's just one single object that contains a lot of things next to each other. You can think of a structure as something like an array, but instead of using indices to count the elements and find the element that you want, it has names for each of these fields. So let's say, for example, I want to define Barrett. So I say Barrett dot, and that dot is the notation used for creating fields for structures. Fields are basically the attributes that you want to assign to the structure. So you say Barrett is an object that has some attributes, and one of those attributes is its age. So Barrett.age equals 19. Okay. Then I can say Barrett.department is error. So you see, instead of creating a cell array that contains these elements one by one after the other one, I create fields that contain those values, and now if I want to use those values, I can simply call their field name, age, or department. And that can make your life much easier, because if you were, for example, to create a cell array for Barrett, you'd say Barrett equals, what is this sign? This curly bracket? That creates a cell, right? So I could say Barrett equals 19, error, and so on, all other aspects of Barrett. Then what's going to happen is that if you want to get Barrett's age, you have to say, I want the first element, right? So you have to say, give me Barrett, curly bracket 1. What if I use parentheses instead of bracket, the curly bracket? It will give you the cell, right? It will not give you 19. It will give you the box that contains 19, the cell box that contains 19, right? So, but this is really awkward, because let's say you want to give this variable to someone else, and that person doesn't have any idea, a priori, that the first element contains the age, the second element is the department. There's no simple way. So the best way is to provide a descriptive name for those variables that you want to contain in Barrett, those values. So instead of saying Barrett number 1 gives me the age, I say Barrett.age gives me 19, the age of Barrett, right? So very same way here. So you can initialize an empty structure with the function struct, like this. You see it there? But you can also start from scratch, from nothing, and say Barrett. Do I write it correctly, Barrett?
It's 2 T's.
2 T's and 2 R?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry for that. But this is unfortunate. You're the first person in the room, so I remember your name very well. So
That doesn't look like mine. That's totally irrelevant. It's just
Really?
yeah. I'm looking at it in a new light, and it doesn't look like my name.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, what's wrong with it then?
No, it's my name. It's
Oh, okay.
It's just weird.
I could use someone else's. I know a lot of.
No, I'm totally cool with it.
Marshall, you're the next. So sorry. Is that correct, right? So dot, and you say dot, and then you can have a lot of attributes. So Marshall color, it's red. Right, so he has a red shirt. So I say Marshall color is red, and now Marshall has an attribute. So Marshall is a structure that has an attribute color. Now I can get that color by just saying get the value of the color by just saying Marshall color dot color, and it's going to give me the value contained in that variable in that structure, right? And what would happen if I say class Marshall? Try it yourself. So you're going to get a structure, right? Because this is a structure.
Does it matter that your struct doesn't have quotation marks and mine does?
Yours
It has a
could.
single quotation mark around it.
Oh, you mean the red value?
No, I
No,
checked
like a run
class
struct.
S, and then what it returned.
Let me see.
was a struct, like a string.
Oh, no, that's all fine.
Okay.
So I think that's just because you have MATLAB 2017 and mine is 2016. So probably they changed the way they write the class type
Okay.
on the command line, on MATLAB command line. But you can simply add more attributes to it. So you can say Marshall has a new attribute. That's his laptop, which is, I don't know what,
It's an HP.
AP?
HP.
HP, okay. So it's an HP. Now, Marshall has two attributes now. It has color and it has laptop, and you can add more and more attributes if you want it. But the cool thing is that now if you want to use this variable or pass it to someone else or pass it to another function, all you need to do is to just pass Marshall. If I say, let's try it. I've never tried this, but let's try it and see. Amir equals Marshall. Let's see what happens. Okay, so Amir has got all the attributes now from Marshall. See? So by simply saying Amir is equal to Marshall, I get all the attributes that Marshall had in Amir. And now I can change the attributes in Amir by just saying Amir color equals white. You see the value now changed. Okay. Now there are other ways, other cool ways of manipulating and working with structures. But before that, one of the biggest advantages of structures is that you can create an array of structures or a structure of arrays, both of them. So you don't really need to have a strings, for example, here. Let's say you want to store all Marshall grades. You could say Marshall grades are equal to
0.
let's be optimistic, so I'm going to say all 4 and sometimes 5. So you get an A plus as well. So that's it. Now you have all the grades there. So you can have different types. So it's basically very similar to a cell array, except that now instead of calling the elements by numbers, by indices, you call the elements by attributes. You say the color, laptop, grades, whatever you want, right? If you want to add cells, then things get a little bit strange. And that's a part that I sometimes don't understand it fully myself. So if you say, for example, let's add in one more. What attribute do you have, Marshall? That could be casted in a cell, in the form of a cell.
In the form of a cell.
Yes. So
Something that would take an array, correct?
yes. So let's say Marshall quotes.
Work
for-
history.
Work history. Okay, good. Work hist. Then you have multiple places. I don't know. One is at UT, for example. Then some other ones. I don't know. Let's say NASA. You have the label NASA. And let's keep it this way for 2 elements now. And let's see what happens. Okay, it worked. So now let's look at the Marshall object structure and see what it has. So Marshall has now these fields: color, laptop, grades, and a cell array. And if you click on the cell array, it's going to give you the values that are stored in the cell. But we have to be careful with cells, because if you start with initialize a structure with a cell array, then strange things happen, which I'm not really comfortable with myself personally. So like if you copy this, what I have here, and so what I'm doing is that I define a field name f, and then I define a set of values for this field, and then I'm going to define a structure using this field name and the value. I didn't tell you this, by the way. So let me just create the 2 variables, fields and values. And now I want to create a structure. I told you how to create an empty structure, but if you have a structure and you want to initialize the values of the fields for that structure, you could simply say this is the name of my structure, which is equal to a struct, and then inside parentheses you have the field name, the first field name, the value of that field, the second field name, the value of that field, and so on. So if I wanted, let me just remove this for now. If I wanted to redefine Marshall using this syntax, I could say struct Marshall, then color equals, I think this should be always a string. So Marshall color is red. Then what was the second attribute? It was
Laptop?
a laptop, yes. Laptop is HP, so on. You can add more. But you see, so you have redefined Marshall now. So all those previous attributes are gone. Why is it gone? Because I've overwritten everything that was in Marshall. I've redefined Marshall as a new structure variable. So all those grays and everything else are gone, right? But now going back to our example here, so I have a field name and I have a cell array as the value of that field for this structure. So if I say s equals field, which is this string, and the value, which is this cell array, then strange things happen. So now if I say s dot, and if you press tab, it's going to complete it for you. So here's another cool thing with the structures. In MATLAB, if you have a structure, so let's say Marshall, we have already defined Marshall, right? So if I say Marshall dot, and then you press tab, no auto completion. Why? Marshall has some.
Spelled Marshall wrong.
What was that?
You spelled Marshall.
Oh yes, okay. So that's why. So now you add a dot at the end, and then you press tab. It's going to give you all the attributes that exist in Marshall. And this is really cool, one of the best features about structures. And you will notice this. So everything in MATLAB, I told you that everything in MATLAB is an object, right? An object has a class. And what is a class? Class is a collection of variables in the form of structures and a set of functions, right? So for a lot of objects that you have in MATLAB, when you type the object name and then press dot, you get a long list of all the attributes for that object or the functions that it could have or the method that it could have. So that makes your life really easy. Without going to the manual of MATLAB, you can see the names of these attributes and use them easily. So like here, for example, you can press tab and you get different attributes of Marshall, and I want the color, for example. So I press enter and you get the color red, right? So this is it. But now here's the thing. Look at this. I have did you define this by yourself on your own laptop? Okay. So you have S, and if I press tab, I'm going to get automatically the attribute, the only attribute that exists in S. Now if I press F, I'm going to get not only one answer, but three. What's going on here? So I asked for the value of the field F, and I'm getting three answers. Answer 1 is some text. Answer 2 is an array. And answer 3 is a matrix.
Each individual element.
Yes, but the strange thing, so let me show you another strange thing. What if I say S1? What's going to happen then?
This is the first one.
Does it make sense at all? Because I have a structure that has a field name, F. That, at least to me, did not make sense for a long time. But what happens is that when you have a field and a value, which is a cell array, basically, instead of having a single structure object, you get a structure array, which is like you have multiple structures for, so you can have an array of structures. So let me explain to you what happens here. So I could say, for example, S1.F. And if I do this, what do you think I will get? You will get only the first value in the value that I had here, in the value variable. I will only get some text. Why does this happen? So let's have a look at the value of S. So click on the S in the workspace, and there you're going to see that you have one field, F, okay, and your structure has 3 elements. So basically, you have a structure array, and now you can call these elements by their indices. So you can, at least for myself, I sometimes imagine cells, imagine structures as cells that have, what happened to the, so you can imagine structures as cells of 2 dimensions, whose one dimension is index, but the other dimension is a field name, is a string. So you can, instead of using indices to call the element, you can just use the field name instead of the index, right? So you can imagine a cell, a structure like what I said here for you. So when you work with the structures and cells together, you have to be a little bit careful, because instead of creating a single structure that has a cell attribute, you might get a structure array whose values are these cell elements. You see what happens? So instead of having a single object, I have an array of structures with fields F, and each one of them contains something different. So if I say S2, I get, so you see, I had in value I had 3 elements. The first cell element was some text, the second one was a vector, and the third one was a matrix. Magic gives you a matrix. So now if I say 3, I have the matrix, magic 5. Okay. So that's just something to keep in mind. But there are also other functions that you can use with the structures. And the other thing that I wanted to tell you is that you can also add more elements to a structure without using cells. So for example, let's say I want to define a student structure, and this is student. Let's say the first element of it is Marshall. Okay. Now I can add attributes to Marshall. Okay. So I can say Marshall has color, which is red. Right? And just to ensure you that the student variable doesn't exist, you can see the workspace is empty, right? But when I say student Marshall color is red, it's going to create a student structure, and then it's going to create a Marshall structure, and that Marshall structure has an attribute color, right? So if I say now, what is class student, it's a structure. Let's see, student.Marshall. If you press tab, it's going to autocomplete it for you. It's again a structure because it has an attribute, right? What if I say what is student Marshall color? It's going to say it's a character, right? Why is it a character? Because it's just red string, right? So now I can add more attributes to Marshall as a student. So I can say Marshall laptop. So here's a cool thing. You can use the dot notation like this, and that's called static field name. I'll tell you what it is in a second. And this is HP. Got it. So now if I say give me student.Marshall tab, it's going to give me all the attributes that Marshall has, right? But there is also another cool way of creating attributes for structure variables, and that's called dynamic structure. What I showed you at the previously, so this one is called static field name for your structure variable. But there's another way of creating it. You can use
the field name in the form of a string by using parentheses and the quotation mark. So let's say Marshall had another attribute. It was the grades. Okay, Marshall grades. Then it's all for. Okay, so what's going to happen now? You think? Any ideas? Very easy. So it's going to add grades to Marshall. So now if I say student Marshall, it's going to give me all of these. So there are two ways. I could have said simply, try it yourself. It's not enough. I mean, if I do it myself, I know everything. So it's not going to help you. So try it yourself. So I could have said Marshall, student Marshall grades is this. Or I could have simply added the quotation mark parenthesis and use this notation. But what's the advantage of this method? Yes?
That's what I was just about to ask.
Yeah, exactly. Very good question. Yeah, because it seems quite redundant, right? But the cool thing with it is that, let's say you have a structure that has 20 field names. Okay. So let's say Marshall has 20 attributes. And now, in your programming, you want to loop over these attributes and get the value of each one, do some calculations on them, and then send the data back to the user. How can you do this if you don't know those field names a priori? So, one way of doing this is through a function called, so you can use function field names. Hopefully I'm writing it correctly. Student Marshall. What this is going to give me is the list of all the field names that exist in Marshall. See, so it gives me all the field names in the form of a string. Now, what's the use of this? I could have said Marshall field names. This is a really lengthy name, but let's keep it for now. So I have Marshall field names which are given by this function field names, student Marshall, right? Try it yourself. And now all of these attributes or field names of Marshall is going to be in this variable. Now, instead of, so if I say Marshall field names, one, it's going to give me color, right? I think if I want to get the value, I told you, if you have a cell array and use parentheses, what's going to happen? Gives you the cell. So we can test it and see that it's not going to work. So if I say, what did we want to do? So I wanted to show you this, that you can say student Marshall dot, I could say color here to get the color red, the color value, or I could say this, the other notation, the dynamic notation, or now I have all the field names in a variable called Marshall field names, right? And now I could just say give me color. What was the value that corresponded to color? Yes, that was 1. So I could say give me 1. What happened?
We're supposed to have color, and it was supposed to give us 1.
Yes. So instead of using string color, I said use the variable, use the value stored in the first element of this cell array Marshall field names. But it gives us an error. It says argument to dynamic structure reference must evaluate to a valid field name. Why is this error?
It's giving you a cell, not the cell name.
Excellent, yes. So the problem is that I'm giving this function a cell, not the value, the content of the cell. So it doesn't take cell. it has to be a string, right? So I have to use a curly notation to give it the content of the cell, not the cell itself. So you have to use curly strings, curly brackets, and then you get the correct answer. Okay, so that's an answer to your question. What's the use of this dynamic field names? It's actually pretty useful when you need to loop over a list of attributes and you don't know those attributes a priori, but you don't know what they are called. So you can use the function field names, you get all those attributes, and then you define a loop and say, go through this cell array of attributes and give me the value of each one of these attributes in this structure. Okay? Yes?
But in terms
I love questions. Ask me
in
questions.
terms of using the parentheses and the apostrophes,
Yes.
that doesn't matter, though, right?
In terms of using, yes. So you mean like instead of using this,
Yeah.
I could use color. Yeah, exactly. So what happens is,
Yeah, but you can still use field names without
like without this curly brackets.
no, like without using the parentheses and apostrophes. Like if you just put
No, I think it won't work. We can try it.
I thought we just did because we were testing that with grades and we did.
No, let's try it. I'm sure in mine it's not going to work. Yes, and I don't think if MATLAB 2017 lets you do this.
Oh,
So because I told you this, when you don't have the parentheses and the quotation marks, it's called a static field name. So you cannot use a dynamic variable in place of a static field name. So you have to call this attribute using a dynamic syntax, which is the parentheses and the strings. So you have to have the parentheses here. And this is a string, right? So you see why it doesn't work? You need the parentheses. It's because when you add the parentheses, then inside of it, instead of having the field name, you have the string value of the field name. You have the string of the field name itself, right? In the form of a string. So this works. But if I don't want to have this parenthesis, then I have to have the name of the field itself, which is color, right? I don't say quotation mark color. This is not going to work. Whereas this is basically this value here. So by typing, you see, it gives us this error. This is exact same thing as if I use this notation. None of them work. So you should either use the true field name as it is without the quotation marks like this, which is the static form, or you should put the parenthesis and convert the field name to a string. Then it's going to work. And what's the advantage of this second method? It's very advantageous because then you can store all these field names in a cell array or some other array that you want, and then you can call them one by one. I want the second one. I want the third one. See? Yes?
I think the confusion though is like the laptop, you didn't, when you initiated it, you didn't use the parentheses and the apostrophes.
Yes, yes, but you can still use them. So you can say, I can say here, again, for each attribute, I have two ways of calling it. I can say laptop, to get the type of the laptop that I have, or I can say parenthesis, open close, laptop. It's the same answer. Or you could, if I could say student, then that's going to give us the exact same thing. Is the second one laptop? Yes. So was that your question, or did I answer something different? Is that okay? Yes.
Is a static version and a dynamic version of the same?
Yes. So there are two ways to get the value of an element, a structure attribute. You can use the static field name, which is the field name without the quotation marks or anything, and there is a dynamic way of getting the value of the attribute in the structure, and that's using the parentheses and the quotation marks, the field name there, right? So you can think of this parenthesis as a function that takes a string and converts it to a field name, to a static field name. You see? So I hope this is clear. But if not, then ask questions. Yes.
So if I have like a pre-existing structure, like if I made a structure for Ethan and then I created another structure of students,
Yes.
how do I add the pre-existing structure of Ethan as one of like the structures of that without creating a name?
Okay, good. So you're basically asking, like, I have Marshall. That's actually the next part of the lecture. So I have Marshall, which has this attribute. Now I want to have another student. I could do it in multiple ways. I could say, you know, I think a better way of defining the student structure is to have a name and say, name of this student is Marshall. Marshall is not an attribute for a student, right? So Marshall is the name of one of the instances of student. You see what I'm talking about? So a student is just defined as a person who is alive and has a set of attributes. He has names, it has age, laptop, and everything, right? So a better way of defining the student structure is to say, let's clear a student and redefine it. And I'm going to get to your question. So I clear a student, and then I say student equals student dot name equals Marshall. Now I can say student 2 dot name equals Barrett. Okay, you see what I've done here? Now I'm creating an array of structures. So I have a structure called student, which has multiple students in it, and each one of them has its own set of attributes. So this is a little bit more complex than what we have discussed so far. Now I can have a third one, and well, I can add a role to each one of them. Vivek, you're still there. So I'm going to add the third one as Vivek, and now I'm going to add to the third one a role. Say the role of Vivek is TA. Okay, so now let's see what this student structure looks like. So these are the field names for the structure student, name and role, and these are the elements in this student structure array. So I have the first element in this student structure array as Marshall, and he doesn't have a well-defined role yet because I didn't assign anything to him. And it didn't exist. This role did not exist. As soon as I defined the role attribute for Vivek, an empty role is initialized for Barrett and Marshall as well. So I can assign them now by myself. So I could define, I could say role for Marshall is student. Okay, you see, as soon as I type role for Marshall is a student, I get a value for a student for the role of Marshall in class. I could add, this is a cool part, so look at it. So I could add a laptop attribute to each of these people in this structure. I could say student 1 laptop is HP. As soon as I do this, what's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? Exactly. It adds a new field name here, and for Marshall, it has the value of HP because I'm initializing that attribute. But what about the other ones, Barrett and Vivek? They're going to be just 0. I mean, nothing. No, right? So let's see what happens. Okay. What happened? Okay, now I have it here. So you see? So, how many are still confused about the structures? Don't be shy. Raise your hands. Okay. Awesome. That's actually very good progress. So I expected a lot more. But you have a question?
On that last example, the field laptop is not stored within Marshall, and they're only stored in the structure student.
No, they all of them. So basically, what I have done is that I'm creating an array of structures. So you can have a structure that is a scalar, doesn't have any array of, you cannot index it. Or you could have an array of structures, which is like each element of which has its own attribute. Right? So I can define the general generic student structure which has names, age, background, but there is not a single student list, there are hundreds, right? So I can create a long list of 100 students. Each one of them has its own attribute. But since they are all defined within the framework of a single structure array, they all have the same attribute. So if I add one attribute to Marshall, it's going to be automatically created for attributes. So all of that is going to be that's how attributes all of them. But since you haven't defined it, it's just not that.
So what's the difference between like all cell by parentheses and all cell by like what's the difference?
You can imagine so
3 to 4.
Wait for me, CD.
it's going to give you the whole marker, right? It doesn't tell you what is inside of it. It just gives you the marker. It says this is your marker. But if you say give me a curly bracket, it's going to give you the content, open the structure, just the content. This is the content of the first object that you have. Okay, right?
Yes.
So the field name is the it's like the tag, and the attribute is what it's.
Field name is the attribute. So I'm using them back and forth, but they are the same thing. So